Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the International Technical Webinar on Advancements in Biotechnology, hosted by the Department of Biotechnology from St. Joseph's College of Engineering. Before we start, I request you all to follow a few instructions to ensure the smooth sailing of the event. Please do not unmute your microphones throughout the session and do not introduce yourselves in the chat box. Kindly post any questions you have in the chat box and they will be answered at the end. If you face any technical difficulties at any point, relay them in the chat box as well and we will look into it. The feedback link will be posted towards the end of the session. It is necessary to fill it up to get your certificate. Ensure that you fill it up correctly as it will be used to generate your certificate. We will now begin the session with the Tamil Thai Valtu. Now, I request our organizer, Mrs. Yuvarani, to deliver the welcome address.
Thank you, Swatika. Good morning to all. On the behalf of Department of Biotechnology, St. Joseph's College of Engineering, it is a great pleasure and honor for me to welcome all the participants, including faculties, students, and research scholars across the globe. My warm welcome to our HOD, my colleagues and students for Day 3, Session 1 of International Technical Webinar on Advancements in Biotechnology. My kind greetings and a special welcome to our resource person of session 1, Dr. Giridhar Shekhar sir. I welcome you, sir. Once again, I'm happy to welcome all the participants who has joined the webinar and ready to be intellectually intoxicated with the knowledge on protein engineering of split inteins and their application in challenging biochemical context. Now, I request Swatika to introduce our speaker, Dr. Giridhar Shekhar sir.
Thank you, ma'am, for your kind words. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Giridhar Shekhar. Dr. Giridhar Shekhar completed his BTech in Industrial Biotechnology from GCT in Coimbatore. He then went on to pursue his doctorate in the field of biochemistry at Texas A&M University in Texas. He was then a postdoctoral research fellow at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. He was an instructor during PhD and his postdoc period. He has over 5 years of research experience and has published 6 international journals and has done over 3 poster presentations. He is applied for a patent currently. Now, he is a research associate in David Coburn's research group at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx at New York. Today, he will be enlightening us on the knowledge on development of novel split inteins using protein engineering. Sir, you can take over the session.
Hi, thanks for the very nice introduction. If I'm able to share my content, I can get started. Yes, thanks so much for that introduction. So through my PhD and my initial years in my postdoc, I was mostly a structural biologist. I did a lot of biochemistry and a lot of like MD simulations. But the talk I'm giving today is going to be a little bit different take on the stuff I've been working on. I'm giving a little bit of a protein engineering spin towards the projects we have undertaken to give you guys a better idea as to what you can do with protein engineering and how you can like develop new proteins or modify existing proteins for you to further your research goals and for them to become better use in laboratories and in the industry. What is protein engineering? I guess that question is probably, we can address that up top. To know that, we have to first understand what proteins do in the body. Proteins are the functional tools that mediate various kinds of cellular and biochemical processes within the body. These could be like in the form of structural proteins or enzymes or transporter proteins. Basically, most functions that happen within a cell are mediated by proteins. Additionally, they find use in like pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries and as enzymes in food, paper, and leather. And as a protein engineer, what we always look to do is to find these existing proteins and see how we can make them better suited for these industrial or technological purposes that they can be used for. And we improve them by making mutations or modifying them chemically. And this is used to give them advantageous properties and basically with the purview of utilizing them in different industrial or laboratory contexts. So the basic flow of workflow that you take up when you're engineering a protein is first, it starts with discovery of the protein. Whenever a new protein is discovered, we usually go through like genomic databases or through metagenomes, and either by using de novo discovery methods or by using matching and alignment methods to existing proteins, we look to identify novel and new proteins first. And once a protein has been identified, we immediately think as to whether they have any immediate applications in an industry. Right. Say, for example, a simple example would be insulin is used in the body, but it also has use as a medicine for people that are incapable of producing it themselves. What we then do is to see if we can enhance it in any way for certain purposes. Most insulins you get in the market nowadays have been modified and enhanced in some fashion to either increase their production during fermentation processes that are used to generate them, or to give them greater bioavailability and greater stability. So we do that by doing certain kinds of design enhancements, mutating them in certain forms or modifying them in certain forms. And then we do that with always keeping a purview on the applications that they are being used for. So we make these changes and these design enhancements, and this goes back and forth between characterization of the protein and making these design enhancements and then deploying them into the various applications that you can find for these engineered proteins. The protein that we have been working in the lab for the last few years is called an INTEIN. INTEIN is just an abbreviation for an intervening protein. An INTEIN is a protein that is embedded within a host protein called an extine, and it catalyzes this reaction called protein splicing. It is somewhat analogous to mRNA splicing in the sense that the INTEIN excises itself and ends up fusing the extine sequences together to generate a contiguous polypeptide that is connected with a native peptide bond. And this protein splicing happens after transcription. So it is after translation. So it's a post-translational event. So after the polypeptide is synthesized, the INTEIN collapses upon itself, excises itself from the host protein and ligates the protein to form a contiguous protein in which the N-extine and the C-extine, as seen in the figure here, are ligated together to form a contiguous polypeptide. These are found in all three domains of life, which is bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, and in viruses. One interesting thing that you would want to note is that they are more predominant in more ancient species, as in they are more predominant in archaea and bacteria, and they are less predominant in eukarya, and they're not present at all in multicellular organisms. So in terms of evolution, you can think of this as the INTEIN has been sort of getting extinct as we get to more modern creatures. INTEINs catalyze this reaction called protein splicing, and it occurs in two predominant configurations. One is called cis splicing, the other is called trans splicing. Cis splicing is the same schematic that we saw a couple of slides ago, in which the INTEIN is embedded into the host protein in a single contiguous strand of DNA. It is transcribed together as a single unit of RNA, and it's translated into a single polypeptide, which folds. And as you can see here, the part marked in blue, which I'm using to represent the INTEIN, gets cut away, and the two extine parts are joined together using a native peptide bond. The other configuration, which is an evolutionary byproduct of these cis splicing INTEINs, due to some evolutionary event, got split into two parts, and they have been now coded into two separate gene fragments and are as such transcribed as two separate RNA molecules. So you have one RNA molecule containing the N part of the system and another RNA molecule containing the C part of the system, and you encode two polypeptides that are translated. And once these two polypeptides are translated in solution, there is a spontaneous recombination event that happens that causes the INTEIN to be folded together, the split parts of the INTEIN to be folded together. And then this forms a functional INTEIN, which is very similar to what you see here. So as a complex, it now gains functionality. And it catalyzes a similar reaction in which the INTEIN is removed and the extine is spliced together to form a continuous polypeptide. Evolutionarily, INTEINs have always been found embedded in very, very important host proteins, in the sense that these are proteins that are usually involved in processes such as DNA replication or transcription and transcription. So they are almost always essential for the survival of the bacterium. This is interesting chemistry, but like I said, always a protein engineer's point of view of looking of things is slightly different, in the sense that he looks at an interesting chemistry like this, and his first thought is, how can this become useful for me? So in that sense, we have numerous applications in which this chemistry has been successfully used and has been reported in literature. although the biochemistry intrinsically is of a lot of interest to all of us, as a protein engineer and a protein chemist, we always look for these fancy applications for which these inteins are can be used. In today's talk and almost all of my work, I have worked exclusively with split inteins, which are the ones in the split configuration. And they have many unique applications in biochemistry and in biotechnology, and they enable us to do some very, very interesting things in the laboratory. One is to use protein semisynthesis techniques to tag or add modifications to protein. So what you can do is you can encode your protein of interest, as shown in green here, along with the split intein, and you can load some kind of tag onto your split intein. Tagging of proteins without using such kinds of chemical technologies is very non-specific and has very poor yields and results. But with the use of a split intein, it becomes very seamless, and you get a very clean construct that can be used either for industrial purposes or for research purposes in the laboratory. Split inteins are almost one of the very few ways in which you can very seamlessly and easily make cyclic proteins. Some cyclic proteins and peptides have applications as antimicrobial agents, and you can generate libraries of cyclic proteins by using split inteins in this fashion. And the way you do that is you load the split intein on two ends of your peptide or polypeptide of choice, and it spontaneously cyclizes into form a cyclic protein of your interest of choice. Also, split inteins can be modified, trapped, or caged to become conditionally active. In that sense, the split intein can be activated using a trigger. There have been reports in literature for split inteins being activated by effectors such as rapamycin. There are split inteins activated by salt, redox reagents. There are split inteins activated by light, so on and so forth. So these caged or trapped inteins are used for conditional activation, which in which case you can embed the intein of the intein in a protein of your choice, and then based off of external stimulus such as a light or a small molecule effector, you can activate the intein. And then what happens then is, mediated by the protein splicing event, your continuous peptide or the continuous polypeptide is formed, and your protein of your interest is now synthesized in an active format. So you can use this for reaction control and for conditional activation of proteins of your choice. So that is one application. You can also use them for segmentally incorporating isotopes into specific regions of your protein. Say, for example, you have a protein of choice. You can split it into two parts, and you can grow them in different isotopic backgrounds and use the split intein to kind of like form a protein that is stitched together from these two separate parts to get like a continuous contiguous protein, which you can then use for observation through methods such as small angle neutron scattering, or more commonly for NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, and to otherwise make these segmentally labeled, isotope labeled protein constructs. It is quite challenging to do without this sort of readily available chemistry. So this is just one subset of the different sorts of applications you have, but you can think of the whole process in a very broad sense, in the sense that you can use a split intein to split any protein of your interest into two parts, and then you can synthesize them or make them separately, either through expression in expression systems such as E. coli or yeast, or through solid phase synthesis using for peptide synthesis. And then once you have formed these two separately expressed polypeptides or separately synthesized polypeptides, you can use the interesting chemistry that the intein possesses, and then you can form your protein of interest in vitro or in vivo upon recombining these two separately synthesized fragments. So that is the biggest broad way to think about how inteins are useful and how they are applicable. So the mechanism of post-translational protein transplicing is as follows. So without going into too much of the chemistry, I will try to simplify this process a little bit. First, you have to see that the layout is as follows. You have one intein flanked on two sides by two exteins. There are two cysteines involved in this process. One is a part of the extene itself, which is the first residue of the C-extene is a cysteine amino acid. Likewise, the first residue of the intene itself is also a cysteine, which is labeled here as cysteine 1. What happens in the first stage of the reaction is the peptide bond that is immediately preceding this cysteine undergoes an N to S acyl shift, in which case this peptide bond here that is between this terminal amino acid residue of the N-extene and the first cysteine molecule here gets kind of like shifted. The peptide chain is now loaded onto the cysteine to form a thioester. So you can see that COS dash is like it's a thioester functional group. So you can see that from the peptide bond here, the N-extene gets loaded onto the cysteine residue to form a linear thioester intermediate. Then what happens in the next stage is called a trans-thioesterification reaction, which is similar to what you might have studied in your 11th or 12th standard chemistry organic chemistry, which is that you have the transfer of one functional group from one thioester to the other thioester, to the other thioester here. So you can see that this cysteine has functional thiol, and from here from this thioester, it gets loaded onto this thioester here. So it shifts from cysteine number 1 in the intene to cysteine number +1 in the extene. So this trans-thioesterification reaction results in what is called a branched intermediate. As you can see, this is the branch point. You can see that from this part of the protein, the N-extene has now jumped over to this part, right? So you can see that now the N-extene and the C-extene, which are the two parts that are going to be ligated together subsequently, are now very proximal to each other chemically, and that the intene has kind of gone towards the side a little bit. At this stage, what happens is another residue in the intene, which is aspartate 137, which is the penultimate residue in this, spontaneously undergoes a cyclization reaction because this bond here is very, very weak. So what happens is this forms a succinimide, and it kind of cleaves the intene to leave separately. And you can see that in the next, after the succinimide formation, the intene has left this group to give you a sort of like a thioester here, which is very, very unstable and spontaneously cyclizes to form a splice product. And as you can see here, the splice product, the chemical entity is here is a CONH, which we all know to be a native peptide bond. So once this entire process has gone through these different steps, you notice that the splice product does not have any scars, right? It does not have any non-native bonds in it. It doesn't have thioesters in it. It doesn't have in many cases, you can see ester bonds being there, replacing the native amide bonds. That is not true here. So this is a very seamless, clean way of joining two separate polypeptide fragments together without leaving any scars or traces. So this is a very high interest to chemists and protein chemists in particular, because this reaction can now be exploited to kind of join any two protein interests of choice, right? You can load an effector protein onto an antibody using this chemistry, or you can load some kind of like a fluorescent tag onto some kind of protein of your interest. And this chemistry is also very easily scalable because, as you can see, the reaction here does not use any other external enzymes or reagents. It is intrinsic in itself, in the sense that it doesn't need anything coming from outside to enable this reaction to happen. So it is very transferable, which is why, although mammalian cells do not typically have inteins in them, you can take the same chemistry and implement it there, as long as it's able to exogenously express these peptides. It can carry out this reaction without needing any external support machinery from the cell itself. So this makes it a very interesting and potent sort of chemical reaction that can be exploited by protein chemists everywhere. One important thing before we go on to the interesting research elements of this, and this will help you in understanding why we are doing some things or how we are approaching some of our research problems, is what happens in the split intene, right? The contiguous intene is kind of easy to understand. There's one protein in the middle. It is flanked by two polypeptides. It pulls itself out and joins the other two together. That part is easy to understand. But what happens in the case of a split intene? So somewhere during evolution, an intine got split into two and it still managed to survive. And that's the story of the split intine in a nutshell. But for the intine to become active, it needs to form an active complex. So the two parts of the intine, which is now split into two parts, the N intine and the C intine, have to converge together, form a complex, and that complex is the one that is going to have activity. One interesting thing about that, especially for people that are interested in studying protein structures or people that are interested in structural biology and protein folding, is that these fragments of intines that are split are intrinsically disordered in the sense that in itself, they do not have structures when they are split into two parts. But when they do come together, they use this mechanism called a capture and collapse, in which the unfolded parts of the protein kind of capture each other like a fishing hook, like it just latches onto one another, then it folds upon binding. So the binding event itself confers folding to the unfolded parts of the protein, and this helps it collapse into a final complex that is active. So these intrinsically disordered fragments of intine coalesce together, form a functional complex, and that now can proceed and do the splicing activity. So without this assembly of your intines, you do not have an active protein formed, and that in separate, the C intine or the N intine do not have any intrinsic activity of themselves. They need to get together, form this functional complex before they are able to proceed to mediate the chemical reaction of protein transplicing. So in the process flow for protein engineering, I mentioned that everything starts with discovery of proteins, and then you do the modifications, and then you find the applications for them, right? The proteins that we started off in our projects, and I will be talking about 3 success stories we've had with engineering and enhancing these intines to do things that we like and to give them properties that are superior and make them better biotechnological reagents and better use in the laboratory. So it all started with this intine. It's called NPU. It was first discovered in this bacterium called Nostoc punctiforma. It is a split intine, like all the other split intines we have been talking about. It is about 134 amino acids in total, split into 2 parts. The N part is the larger part, which will be called NPUN or int N for any of the other intines that we will be talking about. It's about 100 amino acids long, and a smaller amino acid, NPUC, which is about 34 amino acids long. As you can see in the structure presented to the left here, that in the final complexed form, right? This is the structure of the NPU complex after both the N and the C intine have collapsed together into the final structure. You can see that it is very well coiled in and bound into each other. It is not as though one is folded and the other is just fallen on top. It has formed a nice continuous beta strand with it and has folded into the middle of the protein, which kind of gives you an idea as to why it is unfolded otherwise, because it needs all these stabilizing contacts for it to actually become active. At the time of discovery, this was the fastest intine, and it was discovered, if I'm right, in 2008. It was the first one to report ultra-fast splicing activity, which means that if you take a few milligrams of protein and mix them on the desktop, the splicing reaction is done in the order of a few minutes. So this protein was the first of its kind that had reported this sort of ultra-fast chemistry. Many other members of the DNA split intine family do not have this kind of ultra-fast splicing. So we considered this protein as a very good starting point to see where we can take this further and improve its effectiveness and efficiency in different contexts. But the problem is with this system itself, it is not perfect, right? So it has a few drawbacks. Primarily being, first off, we already spoke a little bit about how in the uncomplex form, the individual NPU and NPUN and NPUC intine fragments are intrinsically disordered. And there is a problem you have with anything that is intrinsically disordered is it likes to precipitate very easily. So the solution yield is not great when you form intine fusion complexes. The second also, this is a naturally occurring intine. It is highly selected and trained to do what it was meant to do in nature. And when you try to take that and start using it in the laboratory, you often realize that things do not work as easily. One of the other drawbacks that it faces is if you remove the amino acids that constitute the native extine residues that it is generally used to mediating the post-translation splicing off, the reaction rate drops a lot. But we don't need that in the lab. We need for it to work in non-native context so that we can use it to do chemistries that are interesting to us. So that is one drawback it has. And also it has a sort of a given topology in the sense that you have a large N fragment and a small C fragment. Sometimes for certain chemical purposes, we would want that to be switched out. I will detail that towards the end where we are investigating atypical split inteins, which is a altogether completely different thing that you are going to be seeing towards the end. As I said, immediately some good protein engineering projects you can think of is, can I increase the solubility and stability of these expressed fused intine constructs? That is, how can I improve the solubility and stability of the NPU in some fashion so that it is more robust to use in terms of biotechnological applications? Second is, how can I reduce the sequence dependence, right? How can I make it more applicable in contexts that are not native to its usual catalytic mode? The third is, can I change the architecture of this split intine in such a way that the N intine is smaller and the C intine is bigger? So these are the three projects, and these are the three success stories I want to talk about this time. So first, let's go on to the first one. So there is a method in protein engineering that is called consensus engineering. So you would have heard of the word consensus sequence with respect to multiple sequence alignments. It is pretty much the same concept. What you do is you take a family of proteins and you generate a consensus sequence that is the consensus between all the different members of the representative family. What has been observed in the past is that the resulting protein always has a greater stability than its individual component members. This is because although different active site residues or different parts of the protein for different members might have had different evolutionary pressures as they have been evolving, the general sequence has no selective pressure on it apart from the fact that your protein has to remain stable. So if you take a consensus sequence from an entire family, often it is observed that these resultant proteins have much better stability and much better expression yield, which ties in very well with our objective here. So this was the method we were trying to do. But there's a caveat in this. The caveat is that NPU is fast. Not all members of the intine family that we had access to are actually fast-acting inteins. So we want to retain the fast-acting property, but we also want to make it more stable. So that becomes a slightly more complicated problem than just taking the entire consensus sequence and just saying that, oh, this is the intine that we are going to try to express and test for stability and kinetics. It's not as simple as that. You have to figure out what is the determinant of fast-acting kinetics. So for doing that, we compared two intines. One is NPU and the other is SSP. NPU was discovered in 2008, SSP about a decade earlier in 1998. And as you can see, the T-half for NPU is in the order of less than a minute for the splicing rate. But that of NPU is much, much slower. It is the T-half is in the order of about 80 minutes, right? So it's about 40 times slower. If you do a sequence alignment, you see that NPU and SSP, the gray parts are the parts that are conserved and the blue parts are the ones that are not conserved, has already a very high sequence identity. So that is good, right? We know those parts of the protein we don't really have to bother about. They do not confer much in terms of splicing. Then what we did is we took these residues here and we split them into different batches, right? And when we split them into different batches, we grouped them with respect to proximity to the active site as batch 1, batch 2, batch 3, batch 4, so on and so forth. The details of which are not really necessary to understand what is going on here. So once we did that, what we did is we introduced these batch mutants into SSP and at various stages tried to figure out if that causes faster kinetics. And once we did that, and this in itself, as you can see, is a pretty laborious process because we had to test about 23 different mutations. We rounded down to residues that we now call accelerator residues. Without going into the gory details of what was modified or what was changed, we came down to these 4 accelerator residues, we saw that once you introduce these 4 accelerator residues, it now restored it's now caused fast splicing kinetics in SSP, which previously did not have fast splicing kinetics. So we took something like SSP that was not really working so well. We did 4 mutations to it, only 4, which in the grand scheme of things is actually very little. We did 4 mutations to it, and now it is nearly as fast as NPU. So now we were a little bit more convinced that if we retain these 4 accelerator residues along with the active site residues, and then we overlaid the consensus sequence on top, then we were more confident that we would get a protein that has this fast splicing activity, but will also have the properties of consensus design that give it higher stability and higher and faster kinetics, or more thermodynamic and chaotropic stability. So let us go on to see if that is what we, or let's go on to see what the intine we have looks like then. Right? We call it the consensus fast acting intine, or CFA as an abbreviation. It is a multiple sequence alignment of 73 members wherein we retain, as you see in the image on the right side here, the accelerator and the catalytic residues, which are in orange and green, were like they were nailed down first. They were not changed at all. And the rest was given as a consensus sequence. And as you can see, the consensus sequence is very similar to the native sequence of NPU. It is 82% identical to begin with. And the changes that are happening are also spread throughout the protein. So it is not localized to one part of the protein, which goes on to kind of shows one thing which we know from literature previously, which is that consensus engineering does not change local things. It usually is like a additive effect of different things that are happening throughout the protein. So it does not improve one thing. It's like improves the general health of the protein rather than to specifically improve one domain or one core, which is what we observe in this case here, which is that all these differences in the consensus are spread throughout the protein. And now we have this protein sequence that we have generated synthetically, right? This sequence does not exist in nature. If you take this protein sequence and run a blast, you're not going to get any natural hits out of it because this has been synthetically generated by us completely. And now we have to test whether our hypothesis that doing such a consensus engineering effort will in fact increase the stability and solution yield of this newly generated protein sequence, which is what we see here. So we did an expression test. We did many expression tests. This is the one we reported in the paper, and this is the one that is very telling as to how good this is. We did a fusion between the heavy chain of antibodies with different intines. NPU is one of them. The other control intines we used are MCHT and AVA, which at that time was a gold standard for relatively high solution yield and relatively high stability intines, which was AVA. We used that as one of the controls in the experiment, and we compared that to CFA. And even without looking at the data quantitatively, you can see that we have a thicker, nice, bigger band, which means that there is more of this protein being expressed. More of it is going into the soluble fraction of the protein expression medium and protein purification medium. And also, if you look at the normalized signal as we quantitated by densitometry, you can see that CFA's normalized signal is much, much higher than that of NPU, which goes on to show that it has greatly increased expression yield. Second thing is, well, we claim that this is going to be more stable, right? And we need some way to check the thermodynamic stability of this novel intine that we have created. So first off is we did splicing activity with respect to temperature. And as you know that usually proteins optimally are active at mesophilic temperatures, which is like 37 is a very normal temperature to incubate your proteins in. But in this case, you can see in this figure here that it is active even as high as 80 degrees, which is outstanding for proteins. As if you've worked with proteins, you know that anything over ambient temperatures, proteins start precipitating or degrading. And the fact that this can retain its activity even at such elevated temperatures is outstanding. The third thing is we also tried it in presence of denaturing agents such as urea and guanidinium hydrochloride. So when you take a protein and you put it in high concentrations of urea and guanidinium hydrochloride, which is like in the order of 4 to 8 molar of these things, and you have to realize that when you use 8 molar of something, it is a lot of it in solution. So what it does is these molecules are capable of breaking the hydrogen bonds that are present in the protein. So it kind of destabilizes and unfolds them. So once the hydrogen bonds are broken in a protein, you know that it will lose its tertiary and subsequently its secondary structure. So it unfolds the protein. But as you can see here, the CFA protein is active even at 8 molar urea. 8 molar urea is usually used to unfold proteins for purposes of purification or inactivation. And it is still able to retain its activity at concentrations at which are usually very, very detrimental to other proteins. Likewise, the thermal denaturation was measured using circular dichroism. As you can see here, NPU has a thermal denaturation T melt of about, I would say, roughly 60 Celsius, but CFA is upwards of 80 Celsius, and it still retains a lot of its folded state at even a very, very high temperature. So I would say that taking this into consideration, we have a protein that is highly active. You can see that the splicing rate, even at ambient and high temperatures, are greater than that of the protein we started with. So we made a protein that is faster. We made one that is more robust in the sense that it is active at higher temperature and higher urea and guanidinium concentrations. We made one that has multiple fold higher expression yield. So in that sense, we can say fairly confidently that we have taken something that is slightly weak and we have made something very, very robust and solid out of it. So that was one of the goals that we wanted to achieve. And we were able to, I'm happy to say that we were able to do that quite successfully here, or we were able to prove that we have achieved that objective we had. And as a protein chemist, you also have to think, what can these things be used for? So one of the applications we were able to demonstrate in the paper is that we took the CFA intine and we used it to kind of create an antibody dendrimer conjugate. A dendrimer is something that is like a multivalent it displays multivalent effectors in your system. So what we did is we took CFAN, we conjugated it to the C terminus of an antibody. We took CFAC and we conjugated to the to a dendrimer. And this dendrimer, for the purposes of illustration, the R group in the dendrimer, which is the chemical functional group that the dendrimer is displaying, here was a fluorescent compound called fluorescein, which is makes it for the purpose of testing, makes it easier for us to identify and determine it. So what we did is we used that to kind of splice it together in medium so that you can see the display of this dendrimer on the surface of these cells that are harboring these conjugated antibodies. And likewise, we looked at the expression yield and the fluorescence, and we saw that using this more robust intine that we were able to generate in these difficult circumstances and conditions, which are usually much too harsh for NPU to work successfully in, we were able to make these dendrimeric conjugates. I do believe that in all the research you do, the biggest testament for your utility and your success is not when you are able to demonstrate that your work is good, is when other people start using what you have created. And I was very happy that among many, this is one of my favorites, is this team from NASA used our intine to make spider silk. So what they did was they took these individual units of these spider silk protein called spidrions, which are, as you can imagine, silk, right? It is going to be extremely insoluble in water. So you are not going to be able to express it in solution because it is going to keep continuously precipitating and not get the exact silk fiber structure that you want. The natural chemistry of the spider is probably so complicated that it is able to still do it successfully. But when you try to do it in the lab, you usually end up with a very difficult time expressing these proteins. What they did was they took this CFA intine, which we demonstrated to be active in 8 molar urea, used that property that they were able to use partially unfolded monomers of this spidrions and patch them up together using our intine technology to make like a long strand of your spider silk successfully in this very well cited and very well research paper. And we were very happy to see that whatever we have done, other labs are able to take it and apply it in their individual researches. So that made us quite happy to see that was happening. So that is the first application and the first success story we had. The second is, as I was talking about, reduce sequence dependence on reaction rate. I did not go through this very much during the start, and that might have left some of you a little bit wondering what I was in fact talking about at that point. But I will take the opportunity right now to kind of elaborate on what I was saying in that context. So as a recap, this is the general reaction. You have the two polypeptide fragments, the int N, along with conjugated along with your N-hexene, your int C, the C-intine, along with your C-hexene. And you see that you have the complex formation and the ligation reaction that gives us the intine complex gets excised and goes away separately, and you have the contiguous product with the peptide bond. In the mechanism, we spoke about the C+1 cysteine residue, which is there as a part of the hexene, the C-hexene in particular, as one of the residues that participates in the splicing reaction. This is requisite. You cannot change it because otherwise you will not have the trans-thioesterification reaction. You need to be able to jump from one cysteine sulfhydryl group to the next one, right? So without that cysteine, the cysteine +1, there is going to be no splicing reaction. That we cannot eliminate. But what we also found was the residue right next to it also severely modulates the reaction splicing rate. The wild type residue, wild type as in what happens in nature, what occurs in wild type NPU is that this residue is a phenylalanine indicated with an F here. As you can see, the T half for that reaction is fractional. The axis is so small you barely even see it. And we showed earlier in the previous graph that it's in the order of 1 or 2 minutes. When you go to non-native context, non-native means if, say for example, due to the nature of your protein, you are not able to provide in that position a phenylalanine residue. Your native protein may have other residues in that region, such as alanine or glycine or proline. What happens is you have a drastic reduction in reaction rates when you substitute non-native residues, which is very bad in the sense that it now limits your synthetic applications that you can use this intine for, because in many contexts, it doesn't seem to be working as well. And also when you're doing things such as protein cyclization and you're combining that with sort of like randomizing your protein sequences, you need your intine to be active in all contexts, else your library is not going to have like a very uniform display of the different amino acids. It's only going to splice the fast acting ones and not going to splice the slow acting ones. So your library is going to be very biased. And for reasons like this, we want to have an intine that is a little more, we like to use the word promiscuous, because in terms of enzymatic activity, you're more used to hearing the term specificity in the sense that this enzyme is specific towards a certain substrate or a certain reaction. Whereas here we want the opposite of specificity. It is in fact specific to phenylalanine, but we don't want that. We want it to be promiscuous. We want it to be non-specific and more accommodating of amino acids that are not native to it. So how do we go about doing this? How do we take this intine that has this high specificity and say that, no, you have to work in all these different contexts that are of interest to me, right? So that is a fairly challenging product. So what you want to think about then is, what is conferring the specificity? Why is it being specific? I have pruned out a lot of data of what we have done and analyzed, and I will cut to the core of what is happening. This took a lot of investigation towards determining the 3D structure by NMR and their chemical shifts and things like that. I'm not going to get into that for this purpose because I feel like we can simplify this a lot. There is one important catalytic residue, which is a histidine. This is numbered histidine 125. And I would be referring to this sometimes as the F block histidine. So there is a loop in the protein that is very close to the active site called the F block. And there is a histidine located there. And that acts as a acid base in the chemical reaction, right? What happens is the phenylalanine, as I shown here, the F is for phenylalanine, and which is that ring here, right, is stacked onto this histidine and kind of pushes it into the active site. And when this phenylalanine is removed and you have something smaller there like alanine, which instead of this bulky aromatic group only has a CH3, or a glycine which does not have a side chain, this sort of steric restriction is completely lost. So now the histidine is kind of like spinning about in solution and doesn't have this like poised position into the active site. Right. So we were able to find that out by a couple of different things. And the most telling of which is this figure here. We did what are called molecular dynamic simulations, in which what we do is we take the three-dimensional structure of the proteins as determined by other methods such as X-ray crystallography or NMR. We take that and we define the topology of these different atoms that are there in the structure using basic physics principles, right? And then we kind of define the behavior of the atoms in terms of different probability functions and define them in what are called force fields. And then we do a computer-based calculation that calculates the position or the behavior of these atoms as time progresses, which is what you see here in the x-axis. Here is a time in a few nanoseconds, right? And then you measure the positions of the atoms of the entire protein as time progresses. Here, from that big simulation, I have pulled out one tiny bit of information, which is what angle, side chain angle, is the histidine 125 occupying over the course of time. In the case of phenylalanine, you can see that it is predominantly located in this one single dihedral angle. It makes one excursion, it stays there, gets back to its native configuration here, right? So it is predominantly fixed in one position. But when you remove that kind of steric effect imposed by phenylalanine, and replace that with the glycine, you can see that now it makes various excursions into different configurations. And in fact, it stays in this one configuration towards after 300 nanoseconds for an extended period of time, which is actually pointing distally from the active site. So it kind of, the histidine spends a lot of time not looking at the active site, but at these other unfavorable positions, which are not good. So this is the only side chain dihedral conformation that is useful. And all these other configurations that it is in is not useful. So you can see that this loss of steric restriction, right, loss of conformational restriction correlates with the loss in ultra-fast kinetics. So we, our hypothesis at this point was that if we somehow, right, make this histidine point towards the active site, irrespective of the phenylalanine or not, right, if it points at the active site all the time, I think we can restore the fast kinetics in all contexts. That was the hypothesis we made. So again, this was the objective, to create a mutant NPU that has fast kinetics irrespective of your exchange residue that is being present there, right? So preceding the histidine, there are 3 residues in the F block that are, so histidine is at position 125, residues 122 to 123 are highly dynamic, right? So we thought if we can do a bunch of mutagenesis in that region and somehow rigidify this loop, perhaps we'll get a version that is active all the times. So what we did is called a method called saturation mutagenesis. So we take this protein, the gene sequence of this protein, kind of do a PCR reaction, polymerase chain reaction, using primers that have randomized nucleotides at these positions, right? So when you randomize the nuclear code, you randomize the protein code, right? Because the DNA to RNA to protein is the sequence of information flow, right? So you randomize the nucleotides in that position using different primers, and then you will end up saturating that loop, as in you will introduce all mutations into that loop, right? So once you do that, next question is, how do you select, right? You've taken a protein and you've randomized the loop. How do I select for fast acting ones? And that is an interesting question, because we are not going to be able to purify every single one and test it for splicing activity in the lab, because you're talking about 20 different amino acids at 3 different positions. That's 20 times 3, which is 8,000 if I'm right. 8,000 different mutants, you're not going to be able to screen that. So you have to couple that to a selective screen. which is what we did by taking our intine of choice, which was NPU, and embedding it into kanamycin resistant gene, splitting the kanamycin gene product into two parts. So now only when splicing happens, right, effectively, you will have kanamycin resistant gene product being produced, right? If this splicing reaction is ineffective, which I kind of mentioned earlier in the case of glycine, the splicing efficiency is highly reduced, right? So in that case, what happens is the kanamycin resistant gene product is not produced very efficiently, so it does not have kanamycin resistance. And now what we do is we take this loop that I spoke about earlier, and now we randomize it. So now if you do the sequencing in that region, it will say XXX because it doesn't know what is there because it's completely randomized in that. And then now with that library of this mixture of different plasmids, we do a selection assay. So when you do a selection assay, what happens? Only the ones that are highly active in the higher kanamycin concentrations will be selected. So as you can see, the results of the screen here is when you see the for the wild type phenylalanine in this kind of kanamycin selection assay, you can see it is growing even at a very high kanamycin concentration of 50 micrograms per milliliter. And this was done in like a regular LB plate. It's not even that complicated really. It was done only in a LB plate. And then what happens when you remove the phenylalanine and put a glycine, you don't have any colonies on your LB plate, which means to say that the kanamycin resistant gene product is not being produced efficiently. And when you do the library, as in when you randomize it and use the same glycine context, you see there are 1 or 2 colonies that are coming up in some of the lower kanamycin concentrations. So these are colonies that have reverted back to fast splicing kinetics by virtue of these saturation mutagenesis experiment that we have done. So we can select this these colonies, and we can then kind of like characterize them to see what is happening in terms of actual kinetics, right? So we took these colonies and we found out that one loop mutant kept displaying itself again and again, which was when the wild type residues, which was ERD, which is glutamate, asparagine, and glutamate, arginine, and aspartic acid was replaced by glycine, glutamate, and proline, right? And this glycine, glutamate, proline is called GEP, which is usually found in regions of proteins that are kinked or looped. So we saw that if you use the GEP model instead of the wild type, it has a higher kanamycin resistance in the presence of all amino acids, and it also has likewise a increased splicing efficiency, right? So you can see that it has a faster splicing activity, which is shown by the low T half, even in the presence of unfavorable externe contexts such as glycine, glutamate, and other amino acids that you can see here. So we have been able to demonstrate that by doing such a kind of a saturation mutagenesis experiment, we have been able to generate these novel, this new novel loop mutant, which has fast acting kinetics, irrespective of the context of the externe residues that are present proximal to the intine itself. So going on to the structural basis of the promiscuity, I'm kind of going to gloss through this. What we see here is the exact same thing that we hypothesized, which is that in the wild type phenylalanine, it was restricted conformationally, and we lost the conformational restriction in terms of the when you added the glycine extine. When we use the GEP mutant, you see that it looks quite similar to the phenylalanine case again, which means to say that it has now become conformationally restricted again. And this was observed through MD simulations. There was also some NMR experiments that we have done to confirm that this is in fact true. We are not just relying on a bunch of computer calculations. We also did a bunch of NMR experiments to kind of corroborate this hypothesis. And it seems to very well corroborate with our hypothesis. So again, it was a good success story for us that we were able to predict how we were going to make these things, and we were able to successfully follow through with that hypothesis and create a mutant intine that has a high splicing activity irrespective of all contexts. So the next and last part of the talk is going into designing intines with novel split architectures, right? So this is the conventional architecture. So most split inteins are split in this fashion, as in they are split in the way NPU is split, which is to say that it has a large N intine and a small C intine, which kind of coalesces to form the complex. We've been through that a couple of times. And it has this certain topology. If you take NPU and you just move the split site so that you have a small N intine and a large C intine, that complex is not functional. So it is not as trivial as simply just moving the splice points and it is more complicated than just shifting the split point of the split intine. You need to have a little bit more of an involved engineering effort if you want an atypical intine. Then also the question comes as to why would you need an atypical intine? You already have a very functional N-intine, which you have improved significantly in the first two projects. It's that these smaller intine fragments are synthetically accessible. And when I mean synthetically accessible, I mean that you can generate them by using solid phase synthesis. And when you do by solid phase synthesis, you are able to introduce a lot of different modifications and chemical modifications, because you can do the chemistry on a surface rather than inside a cell. So it is more accessible for doing challenging chemical modifications, including post-translation modifications or tagging with fluorophores and things like that. So it is useful to be able to apply this sort of synthetic access both to the N side and to the C side. So we have been looking for that. So we had to now go look for different things. And a few years ago, I would say about 3 years ago, a paper was published in which they looked at the metagenome from a lake, a hypersaline. Hypersaline means it's like extremely salty lake in Antarctica called the ACE Lake. So they discovered this intine called ACE-L/TER-L. And they demonstrated that it has an altered atypical split structure, in which case the N-intine was only 25 amino acids large and the C-intine was 100 amino acids long, right? But the problem was it was a very, very terrible intine. It had absolutely rubbish expression yield. It had very low solubility and aggregation and very slow reaction kinetics, and it was really unusable in the laboratory. In fact, we started working with this, and we at that point were ready to give up on it because it was such a dead lead in terms of characterization of this intine. But then we were thinking, well, before we even start characterizing this atypical intine, why don't we go ahead and start with a consensus sequence, which worked really well in our attempts past. So why don't we go and take this as a basis and develop a completely new atypical intine with more potential for practical use, and use that as a model to characterize how atypical intines behave. Because clearly their behavior is going to be very different because the topology of the intines are completely different. So their solution association and their kinetics and their mechanisms are going to be slightly different from the canonical intines. So we thought we could use that as a model to kind of observe and look at these intines. So we went straight up with the consensus effort, and this was one step easier than the previous one because we were not so worried about the fast-acting kinetics in this case, because it was a terrible intine to begin with. So we just took consensus engineering approach, and immediately we saw, as you can see in this figure, 5-fold to 10-fold increase in expression yield. It is now stable at higher temperatures, which is very, very useful. If you're able to express your protein only, you're going to be able to work with it in the laboratories, right? So now it has, the previous protein, which had no stability in 30 degrees and 37 degrees, has now increased higher stability in this temperature range, and which now we are so happy that we can now work with this and characterize it with the different, for the different things we want to find with this intine, right? So next question immediately was, how does this intine assemble, right? The previous one we showed that I told you that it has this capture collapse mechanism, it has this intrinsic disorder, and then it folds upon binding. Are those observations and principles still true for this new intine that we have discovered, right? Because sequence-wise, it's way different from the other intines. So we are curious if the method is still conserved here, the assembly method is still conserved here. So we go on to see what the method of association is for these intines. So for that, we did NMR spectroscopy to characterize the entire thing. I think I'm not doing great on time, so I'm not going to go into too much of how this is being done. But the general principle is this, right? All things, right? All nuclei are basically just magnets, right? They have a magnetic dipole. So if you put them in a gigantic high field magnet, they will all align to the magnetic field. Just like how a magnetic compass aligns to the field of the earth, you put a bunch of atoms, they will all align to the magnetic field. And you can put them inside like a regular RF coil. And as engineering students, this should be fairly intuitive for you to understand. You take something in a magnetic field and you apply a RF pulse, you apply a magnetic field on it, right? So you cause them to kind of tip over into off axis from the field of alignment in which they were. And as you know that it's the same thing, when you shake a magnetic compass, what happens? It flicks about and then it tries to go back and align back to magnetic north. The same thing happens inside a magnet, but in the atomic level. So what will happen is it will try to go back into alignment with the magnetic field. Again, going back to the concept, what happens when you move a magnet inside a coil? Dynamo principle, an electric field is generated, which you can record, right? So when you record that, you get this kind of a decay pattern called a FID. And when you do a Fourier transform, you can deconvolve this sort of time data into frequency data and to see in what frequency these things are vibrating in. And like all magnets do, if there's a magnet and there's another magnet close by, they will start interacting with each other. So these things will modulate and talk to each other, so to say. And these kind of interactions between the different magnetic components of the protein, which is a molecule made up of many tiny magnets or many atoms, you can characterize these long-range interactions between these magnetic components and say what the protein structure is or what its dynamic properties are, or characterize it in that sense. So that is like a simplistic understanding. So here we did NMR with the intine that we have. The intine we call consensus atypical or CAT intine, which was the robust intine with the atypical architecture. We take only the N intine and we measure a NMR spectrum here called an HSQC. You can see the blue dots are the ones corresponding to when it is in an unbound format. Then we add the binding partner and observe selectively only the CAT-N again. And you can see that it goes from a spectrum in which all the dots are kind of close together with one in which they are more dispersed. When it is close together, it means that it is unfolded and all of the, there is no kind of structure because it's kind of like flopping about. But when you have structure, it kind of each separate amino acid has a separate property, right? So it will kind of spread the peaks out like that. And so you end up with like a dispersed spectrum. So this transition from a narrow spectrum to a dispersed spectrum is an indication of going from a unfolded to a folded form. So we can say that in this case also, when you add the binding partner, it goes from a free form, like an intrinsically disordered form, to a more folded form. Likewise, we do the reverse experiment with CAT-C. We take CAT-C, we measure a spectrum, and then we add the unlabeled binding partner, which is CAT-N, and you see that you have what initially is a very narrow undispersed spectrum now brightens up and has like a very well dispersed spectrum. So this is a like for NMR spectroscopists, this is like a very easy test to say that if something is folded or unfolded, and we are able to demonstrate that upon adding the binding partner, it gains a folded state, and in the absence of the binding partner, it kind of remains unfolded. Right. So this is the same thing that we observed in NPU. So we were very confident that we had like intense nostalgia that, oh, this is something we have seen before. And this also undergoes this similar disorder to order transition upon binding to its cognate partner. This structure, this entire slide is at least a year of work. We went on to determine the NMR structure. Different NMR structures are slightly different than X-ray and EM in the sense that they are not static pictures. They are actually dynamic models that you build. Like I said, right, all atoms are tiny magnets and they modulate each other when they are in the magnetic field. So we get these kind of like distance parameters that you get between different components of a protein. And we take all these distance parameters and we call them distance restraints. So we know that this atom is close to that atom, and atom A is close to B and C and so on and so forth. We take this set of information, right? And we have such like about 4,000 different restraints such as this. And we feed it to a computer to do a calculation. And once you do that, what happens is it comes up with a model which satisfies all these parameters. And then you get the 3D structure of the protein. You can build a model of the protein. And the model you see here is that of the CAT intine that we were able to determine. It is quite similar to the NPU in the sense that it has the same horseshoe topography that all intines have. But you see that to accommodate its different starting topology. It is kind of skewed a little bit. It's kind of like, it's almost as if they took that nice symmetric NPU horseshoe and kind of squished it on the top a little bit. And so that is the new structure. And to accommodate its new atypical split, it has slightly modified its final structure to be able to do that. And we looked at the active site. The active site also has, again, 2 histidine residues. And as you're seeing now, that's a conserved theme. So one is called the G block histidine, which is absent in NPU, which is present in CAT. And we were able to see that this is very well catalyzed poised for catalyzing the second part of the splicing reaction. And the His78 here is very well poised for catalyzing the first part of the reaction. So we were also able to determine which residues are catalytically relevant and catalytically important, and all that we have been able to report in our paper. Finally, we were looking to see if we are able to map kind of like the local order of the intine onto the protein complex. In NPU, you know that the C is the small intine and N is the big intine. And it is the N intine is split into 2 lobes. The first part is slightly structured and the second part is more disordered compared to the first part. We were wanting to see if the same thing holds good for CAT as well. The way we did that is we took these split intines in their unbound form. So in the sense that we wanted to see if the same topology exists in CAT or whether it's slightly different. So the way we did that is we took these split intines in the unbound form and we subjected them to partial proteolysis. Regions of the protein that have residual structure or partial structure will be protected from the protease because the protease will not be able to freely bind to it. But the parts that are extended and floppy and disordered are going to be digested by the protein. So in that sense, what we get here is that you see a lot of digestion in NPU in the second lobe of the N intine, and the C intine is almost completely digested. In CAT-N, it's very different. In CAT-N, the N part is completely digested because it's a tiny fragment. It doesn't have any stabilizing contact, so it got completely digested. But in terms of CAT-C, you found disorder in 2 ends, and the structural part was in the middle, which is very interesting because in both these cases, the disorder is strategically distributed such that the protein is only functional when it's fully folded, right? Because it doesn't want to be functional when it is not in the complex form. So it is kind of protecting all these side reactions or these other bond breakages that can potentially happen if it is already predisposed for, like say, for example, if the protein is already trying to cleave the C part away before the N part is loaded, you're going to have all these side products that are not useful. So cleverly, the protein has kind of kept itself disordered in these strategic regions so that it kind of only is active upon complexation. And this is of interest for us in the sense that NPU and the association was mediated by a whole bunch of electrostatic interactions, but in the case of CAT, it is completely different. It was mediated by a bunch of hydrophobic reactions. The thing with electrostatic interactions is it is an interaction between a positive and a negatively charged group, right? So if your reaction medium, as in your splicing medium in vitro or in the laboratory experiments you're doing, if it has to have high salt, this electrostatic interaction will be ruptured by the ionic strength of the buffer. So you are not able to use that in context with high salt. Fortuitously, what we have here is that it is highly tolerant to high buffer ionic strengths. So by discovering and characterizing this, we have discovered a property of this intine we would have not known otherwise, that we can use this in high salt concentrations. So this becomes a immediate application for this intine over NPU. So this can be used in context where you need to introduce high salt into the medium. And so that was the 3 different kind of projects we have taken up, and we ended up with one robust intine, one non-specific intine, and one intine with atypical architecture. And that has that I think is the summary of most of my research that I've been doing in recent times. So yeah, this is just like a model for the complex formation, which, as I show, this is like the multi-lobe structure for the C intine and the N intine, and then you have activation that is coupled to assembly and is mediated by hydrophobic interactions. So the ongoing project, which is the last thing I want to talk about, and this is, I promise you, this is the last slide of what I think has already been a fairly long talk. So we successfully looked at the extreme dependence in reaction rate in second part of the talk today with respect to NPU. the question now is what happens in CAT? Does it similarly have an extreme dependence? The answer is yes, but not identical to that of NPU. In NPU, what we observed was that the dependence was almost completely on the C side of the intine. Here we see that in the C side of the intine, which is like residues numbered +2, +3, so on and so forth, there's really negligible effect on the reaction splicing rate. But on the other hand, it is highly affected by reaction rates in the N terminus. So we are trying to go about doing a similar process for the N intine. But remember, we talked about two histidines that were there. The one that is modulating this part, right? The N part of the reaction is not really useful. You can't really do saturation mutagenesis for technical reasons. Not that we didn't try. We still went ahead and tried and failed miserably on it. But there, for technical reasons, we didn't expect it to work. So we are using a different approach. We are doing what is called error-prone PCR. So we deliberately introduce error in our PCR and then use the same kanamycin type of screen to identify mutants. So even prior to COVID coming in, we picked up a few mutants in the lab and we are in the process of looking at that right now. We found one that has increased tenfold activity with glycine. I'm not reporting the exact mutants because the data is still unpublished and I would like to protect that part. But yeah, we are very promised to that. So we are going to the next stage where we characterize it and find applications for these new and novel intines that we have. So with that, I come to the end of my talk. So I'd like to thank people that were involved in the project. My PI, Dr. David Coburn. And this project was completely done in collaboration with Dr. Tom Muir's lab in Princeton and Dr. Adam Stevens, who now is in UCSD. He and I collaborated very actively in this. He was basically a genius in setting up assays and screens and finding new applications and things like that. Neil was the one that started the NPU prior to me starting the project, and Joseph was also helpful in preparing some proteins. Also, thanks to members of the Cohen Lab, Sashi, Sam, and Jerry, who are always there for discussion. The NMR facility at Einstein, through which we did a lot of work there. I didn't present too much of it, but we did a lot of work at the NMR facility and the Structural Biology Center at New York. A lot of the computation was done on supercomputers at UCSD. It's a facility called Exceed that you can write grants for, and you can get supercomputer time to do these highly computation intensive MD simulations. And all the grant money was provided by the National Institutes of Health. And I would also like to thank the organizers for basically coming up with this fantastic idea of doing these webinars, which gives opportunities for people like me to share my work, and also for people in India at this time of COVID to still maintain interest in keeping themselves familiar with research and things like that. So thanks for the opportunity. I'll now be able to take questions.
Yes, sir. Thank you for an informative presentation on intines and using engineering to enhance them, for having fast splicing activity as well as their applications. We have a couple of questions here, sir. So I'll read them out to you, and then you can answer them, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sir. So the first question is, how are intines related to nascent polypeptides functionally?
So in terms of what you saw today, they're all mostly in exogenous context, right? So intines are present naturally in many living creatures, especially bacteria. They are embedded into the protein, and as the polypeptide of the protein is being translated, the intine also gets translated, and it's in the cytosol. And when two separate parts of the intine form a complex together, it forms the contiguous protein that is required. For example, the NPU intine that I mentioned, it has been embedded into the DNAE gene product, right? So when DNAE is being expressed in Nostoc punctiforma, it is expressed as two separate polypeptides, and it requires for the complex formation and the PTS activity for DNAE to be formed in Nostoc punctiforma.
Thank you, sir.
I don't know if that answers the question, though.
Yeah, I think it did, sir. Okay. The next question is, what are the industrial applications of these split intines?
So as was mentioned in the initial introduction, that we are now we have now filed for a patent. That's not the only one. So our patent here is for industrial application for the cat intine. Prior to that, we also did for the other CFA intine and things like that. So right now, there is a company in Spain with whom we are joint filing the patent. So their primary product is they make antibody effector conjugates. Say, for example, for lab purposes, if you're a lab that requires a certain type of antibody conjugated to a certain kind of effector, which is in most lab settings is quite hard to make, because you cannot just take an antibody and say that I want to add a fluorescent tag to it. It really does not work like that. You need to have the right kind of chemical tools to be able to tag an antibody with like a fluorescent tag such as fluorophore. So this INTEEN technology becomes immediately applicable for things like that. Or say, for example, if you're trying to generate a protein, say, for example, you're trying to make a protease that is required for some industrial application. Say, for example, I'll say in tanning, right? For tanning of leather, you need cold active proteases. So for that case, you cannot express proteases in high quantities inside cell, because the protease is going to be toxic to the cell. If you digest all the protein inside the cell, it's going to die. What you can cleverly do is you split the protease into two parts, synthesize them separately, then mix them together, and it spontaneously forms the protease of your choice, right? So you can use for clever industrial applications such as that. But you also have to realize this has only become viable in the last 15 years. 2008 was when NPU was even discovered in the genome, right? So in terms of transitioning to technology, we are talking about that right now. I don't know that there are too many industries using it actively, but that's the reason for doing the research itself.
Okay, sir. The next question is, how INTEENs are able to collapse themselves? What signal is given by the cell in specific for the collapse?
That is a fantastic question. And I'll tell you why, because this is the kind of questions I like to research about this. Some of it was covered towards the end of the thing, because there are two different modes between the native and between the canonical and the atypical. For terms of this discussion, I'm going to talk only about the canonical. The simple answer is it is spontaneous. It is just as how you would form a complex between like a drug and a protein, or two different proteins, like a protein-protein interaction. The difference, however, is that they are unfolded to begin with, and that the folding is and the folding and the binding are coupled, in the sense that once the two polypeptides come and interact with each other, the disordered polypeptides come and interact with each other, they kind of start forming this network of salt bridges, and that helps it form that beta sheet that is there between the two, and then it folds into itself in that fashion. So that happens spontaneously. You don't need to add any additional mechanisms. I could literally take purified polypeptides, add them in a test tube, and they will spontaneously collapse and form the splice product.
Okay, thank you, sir. The next question is, can you explain how many alpha helix and beta sheets are present in your synthesized INTEEN? And can you also include the molecular weight of the INTEEN?
So the molecular, so it's about 134. So it depends on which INTEEN you're talking about, but the NPU and the CFA are about, like the N INTEEN is about 100 amino acids, and the C is about 34 or 33, depending on which one. So times like 110 is the molecular weight, right? So the N fragment is going to be like about 11 to 12 kD, and the C fragment is going to be about like 3 kD or 4 kD. Oops, did I lose my screen share?
No, so it's there, so we can see it.
Okay, because I wanted to go to the topology of the INTEEN to show the structure. So this is NPU, and as you can see the structure here, there are two helices. So one is there in the N part of the helix. As you can see, this is the N terminus of the NPU-N. There's one hairpin here, and there's a helix there. There's one further downstream here on the C part. The C INTEEN and N INTEEN form like this extended beta sheet. That's like, I don't know if you should consider that as two beta sheets or maybe one, right? There's one extended beta sheet. And then you have this other beta sheet and this hairpin over here. So I would say typically it's it's not like really special in terms of the content of the helices and the beta sheet in itself. What is interesting is this twisted topology that it has upon folding, this horseshoe shape. That for me is like really interesting, because it's very hard to get that kind of like twined effect when one thing is like basically twining itself into the other part of the protein. That is the interesting thing to me in terms of the protein architecture.
Thank you, sir. Now we'll move. The last question for this session is: will INTEENs affect the originality of other proteins during segmental incorporation?
that is $1 million question because we don't want it to, right? That is the big thing. We are working so hard because we don't want it to leave any scars. First thing I can tell you is it all depends on your experimental design, right? You have to choose a good part in which you're going to do your, you split the protein. So when you're doing segmental labeling or semi-synthesis, you got to split your protein of interest into two parts. You have to strategically select these places in like loops or things so that you increase the chances for success of your final folded protein. Because if you kind of break a helix in the middle or something like that, or you break a sheet in the middle, the chances of success are going to be slightly reduced because you might form like misfolded or precipitated proteins during even prior to splicing. You might try to mix them together, but as you express them, they might get misfolded or kind of like precipitated. But one thing that we cannot eliminate at all is that you need that one cysteine to do the splicing. There is no way of getting around that part yet. We are still looking at other inteins that use serine instead of cysteine if that is more amenable for your research purposes. So this is a question that can only be solved by experimental design, and that again is the primary thesis of protein engineering is we are trying to make these better for the lab. And so far, the scar left behind is minimal. And the biggest thing is there's a native peptide bond and not like some like ester or something different like that.
Thank you, sir. With that, we conclude the Q&A session. Thank you very much for taking your time to answer all of these questions, sir.
No problem. Thank you.
Yes, sir. So now I call upon our organizer, Ms. Yuvrani, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Swatika. Today, I take the opportunity to put all my gratitude into words. On behalf of Department of Biotechnology, I first and foremost express my sincere gratitude to our patrons, Honorable Chairman, Dr. B. Babu Manogaran, sir, our Managing Director, Mrs. S. Jasipriya ma'am, and our Director, Mr. B. Sasishekhar, sir, for giving us the opportunity to conduct this international technical webinar on advancements in biotechnology. I would like to express a deep gratitude to our beloved Principal, Dr. Vaddi Seshagiri Rao, sir, our Dean Ma'am, Dr. B. Parvatavati ma'am, for providing continuous moral support, encouragement, and guidance. I would like to take this opportunity to place on record our hearty thanks to our HOD, sir, Dr. J. Kumar, for the perfect logistics support and guidance he has extended to all of us in organizing this great event. I would like to express my sincere thanks to our advisor, Dr. Renuga ma'am, for her constant encouragement and advice for this program. I extend my special thanks to our keynote speaker, Dr. Giridhar Shekhar, sir, a research associate, David Cowburn Research Group, Albert Einstein College of Medicine, New York, for accepting our invitation and for gracing your important work and sharing with us your findings and opinions today. Thank you, sir. I sincerely want to appreciate our speaker for making a tremendous presentation and making this session interesting and significant. Your presentation brings out the research knowledge in the field of protein engineering, and this will surely encourage our participants to explore new avenues in this area, sir. And also participants, during our earlier discussion with our speaker, he was very kind enough to attend our meetings without any bothering about the timings. And it's actually about almost 12:30 midnight now in New York. And thank you, sir, so much for your time. I once again thank you very much, sir, for splitting our minds and creating slots in our brain to think about inteins. Thank you, sir. I also extend my gratitude to my co-organizers, Dr. LFA Anandraj, sir, and Ms. G. Kalavati, ma'am, for their enormous cooperation in the organization of this event. I cannot just say only thanks to my third-year biotech student organizers for their involvement and their willingness to take on the completion of tasks beyond their comfort zones. I also thank all the participants for the patient listening and for maintaining decorum throughout the session. Last but not the least, I thank Almighty for gracing the occasion, for the successful completion of this occasion. Thank you, and over to Swatika.
Thank you, ma'am. Before we wind up, I'd like to remind you all about our final session that will take place this evening at 5 p.m. and the technical talk will be given by Dr. Sangamitra Saha, who is a lecturer at the Department of Natural Science from the University of Houston in Downton, Texas, USA. The presentation will be on investigating phages, its discovery and genome annotation. Once again, we thank you all for attending this session. Stay safe and hope to see you all in our final session this afternoon.